Hey everyone.
Hey.
It's great to be here, and it's great to be at another VLA. Regina's done these for years, and it's amazing. It's such an important, one of the really important spaces we have for thinking about these things in this city and beyond. So I really appreciate it. I'm going to make an admission first. It's towards the end of the day, and I don't have a slideshow. I'm sorry. I'll try to show a minute of video. Just try to stay with me. I know people are maybe a little tired. Second admission, I'm going to stretch a little bit how we ethics and legal limits and think more broadly. So I'm sorry, but trying to speak to my expertise as it meets the expertise and questions the panel's trying to deal with. So what I really want to focus on is some of the limits, and that's limits in the logic, okay, of video organizing and media-based activism that we see and has become so prevalent, right? So, and to do that, I want to talk about some of the cornerstones of media activism over the last 2 decades, particularly the Indymedia movement, which, you know, many of the things we see today, I'll argue through a little bit, have come out of some of the ideas, thinking, logics that emerged from Indymedia, and even before Indymedia from the Zapatista movement in Mexico. And my aim here is for us to be cognizant of the strengths, right? There's real strengths to the role of media and visual advocacy and the internet in our organizing, in the activism we do, in the advocacy that we take part in, but there are also pitfalls. And we aren't as likely to think about the pitfalls, the limits of this logic. And here I'm trying to mark this sort of techno-utopianism that's just been fully embraced by so many. It's intoxicated a lot of scholars like Clay Shirky, but not just scholars, activists throughout and organizers. So the aim is to kind of have us think about some of these questions as we think about the visual advocacy we do. So to start, I want to talk about how in the internet age, media, like some of the birthing of the role of the internet in media activism, and start through the story of the Zapatistas. So, and they're a Mayan peasant movement based in southern Mexico in Chiapas. I'm betting everybody knows them, but just in case some people don't know them, they're also known as the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, or EZLN. So in 1994, Presidents Clinton and Salinas and Prime Minister Sritan announced NAFTA, or a little bit before that, but it was to go into effect in 1994, and everyone knows that the aim of that was to liberalize trade, free trade across North America. At the time, the conditions in Mexico, and particularly in Chiapas, were pretty bad. Chiapas is the richest state in terms of resources, in terms of the sort of natural resources people have, but it's the poorest for people in their everyday life. Mostly this comes from the extraction of the capital from Chiapas to the other parts of the state and other people making a living off those goods. So the Zapatistas felt that this call for a North American free trade agreement was going to be what they called a death knell to their way of life. It was going to just obliterate them. And their thinking was particularly that U.S. products, and particularly U.S. genetically modified corn, was going to rush into Mexico, and it was going to upend the subsistence farming way of life in southern Mexico. A point that actually turned out to be true. After NAFTA went into effect, the Mexico City grew very quickly, and it grew mostly from people coming from the rural countryside and having to migrate into the city because they could no longer make a living in the city. Fine. So the conditions are bad. The Zapatistas see it as two Mexicos, the pretty cultural Mexico that's sold for tourism, and then the poor, kind of actually existing Mexico that people, conditions. So the day that the North American Free Trade Agreement goes into effect, the Zapatistas have an uprising. Many people probably know this. And they put on these black balaclava masks, and they argue that in order for us to be seen, we have to put on these masks and we have to rise up because no one ever heard us or saw us before this. In this uprising, they take over the capital of this state of Chiapas. They take over many towns, many farms. They also take over all the radio stations that they're near. Media's on their mind from the beginning. They say that they're going to take over Mexico, and they call all the poor of the country into a battle with the Mexican government. It doesn't work. right? They call for the poor from throughout the country to come and join them and rally with them, but no one hears it. And so, point being, they're extremely exposed. They're a relatively small army facing a very strong Mexican state, which has got most of its military from the US, and they're going to get crushed. There's a couple skirmishes in Chiapas, 100 or so people die, and the Zapatistas realize that they're in a lot of trouble, and they start backtracking, and their aim is to flee into the mountains and to escape the struggle. And the Mexican army, as you would imagine, aims are to follow them into the mountains and to end this, right, once and for all. So this is the moment that sort of the idea of media activism through the internet began to emerge. This is the moment where it started to get really harnessed. So there were all these social networks of communication that were existing, that were fighting against NAFTA, fighting for environmental justice throughout the Americas. And the Zapatistas and their supporters tapped into these networks. And so they made this call, and it was a call to stop this military struggle, and it worked. Thousands of people swarmed into Mexico City. Thousands swarmed into Chiapas. Thousands swarmed to Washington, D.C., and also into Canada, and demanded a ceasefire. And the Mexican state, which did not want a ceasefire, was forced into a ceasefire, right? Really by both the importance of this struggle but the way the story of the struggle moved through these social networks. Ultimately, there was a peace accord between the Zapatistas and the Mexican state, in which the Zapatistas won some rights to self-determination in Chiapas, which they wanted. Since then, many of those accords, they've lost many of the things. But that was sort of a really important moment where people were really excited about the role of the internet. Following it, the Zapatistas become cause célèbre throughout the world. People, you know, from particularly the US, but, you know, across Europe are really, really excited about them, both because of the struggle, but also because of its intersection with the birth of the cybernetic age, right? So the Zapatistas seize on this popularity, and they have this meeting, this big meeting. About 10,000 activists from throughout the world come into Mexico, come into Chiapas. It's called an encuentro, an encounter. And at the end of the meeting, the Zapatistas say, hey, we're all suffering, and so what we need in order to stop this suffering is an international network of communications. We need to link up all the struggles in all the parts of the world through a network, through the internet, and connect people. And through that, we can start to build larger struggle, right? I was actually going to show just a minute. So Marcos, the spokesperson for the Zapatistas, then a year later doesn't come to New York. He would have been arrested if he tried, but he does a video kind of thing in New York City in the summer of '97 where he makes this same call. It's called Free the Media Conference. I was going to show it, but I don't think we have time, but it's sort of great. You can imagine a bunch of New York media activists in a room, and then on a screen, like 10 feet tall, is Marcos with a black balaclava and a pipe, horse in the background, very romantic, right? And he's saying, we need this network of struggle. So the point being that this idea deeply embedded itself in the logic of Northern activists, right? And flash forward about a year and a half, the WTO meetings are going to be in Seattle. And the WTO, we all know, World Trade Organization, same aims as NAFTA at a broader scale to liberalize trade across the world. And I think everyone knows this, but there's huge protests in Seattle. They shut down the WTO meetings. There's curfew. Hundreds are arrested. And during all of that, the first independent media center is formed, and it starts to take over. So let me just find where I am. Sorry. And the idea of this center was to create local independent journalism, right? One of the founders said, we can't trust CNN to tell our story here. We need to tell it ourselves. If we don't tell the story of the WTO protests and we let Fox News and CNN do it, we can imagine what they're going to do. So we need to build our own infrastructure. So they do. They build their own infrastructure, and they have this open vision of the role of media. And the saying is, don't hate the media, actually be the media, right? So it's prefiguring all that we see today, right? All the things that we're all seeing all over the place. It was birthed really first through the Zapatistas, but then particularly through Indymedia. And so when we think of Twitter, when we think of Facebook, when we think of blogging, when we think of citizen journalism, I think many of these things emerged there. So quickly, the idea caught fire. Within a few months, there was about 10 to 15 of these independent media centers, but within 4 years, there was about 200 of them. They were reporting news in something, they still are, reporting news in something like 30 languages on every continent, about 50 in the US, 50 in Europe, 50 or so in South America, and then a handful in Asia and Africa. And the Indymedia movement is still existing today, for sure. There's a Philly IMC, and importantly, they are multi-platform, right? So it's not just the web. So the Philly IMC, which was born during the Republican National Convention, which happened here in 2000, had a newspaper, the Unconvention. It had a FM radio show, or even a station that they partly were in charge of, and a website. So this happened over multiple platforms. It wasn't just the web. But at the same time, I'd say around 2005, 2006, the vision of Indymedia started to falter. It started to flatline. And I would argue that it's flatlined or taken a turn and become much less active over the last 5-7 years. And so what I want to mark, how am I doing on time?
About 5 minutes.
Okay, so I'll try to move through this quick, but what I want to mark is some of the reasons, some of the real breakthroughs in the logic that kind of emerged, but also some of the pitfalls or limits to this logic. And this is part of my research, but I also think many of these ideas were stuff Milena probably spoke to this morning, you know, ideas that MMP has taken to heart in trying to figure out what work needs to be done, why, and how. So the first critical lesson, and I already marked this, was that the media practices we see today through Facebook, Twitter, and Tumblr, in the Arab Spring to some degree, but certainly in Occupy, were born here, right? And this is logics like open publishing and the importance of user-generated media, logics like the moving of material across all sorts of borders, particularly national borders, so that you can upend, and we've seen a lot of that, particularly with Witness, so you move stories across borders so that you can then put pressure on national governments. This kind of emerged through Indymedia when it created a global network. And the birth and growth of the citizen journalism movement kind of emerged here. I think other things are the fact that media could play this role of knitting together struggles. So here in Philly, and again, this is something MMP thinks about, creating stories where a taxi driver talks about the fight for democracy in the workplace next to a high school student demanding the right to a fair public education, putting those stories next to each other offers the possibility for more of a united front, or the possibilities to prefigure a united front. And media plays a critical role in that, and so the way we think about it is a nervous system. It can be a nervous system of struggles. So those are some of the real breakthroughs. At the same time, and I think this is often what we see, this logic can be taken really way too far, and this is where I want to just end and just put out some points here. So some of the problems I see that emerged for Indymedia, one was obviously that its technology was commodified, by others, not by it. So Facebook, Twitter were much smarter, figured out how to create capital commodities with the same coding programs and took them over, right? Built them to scale that Indymedia couldn't that way. So that's one, but that's not problems in the logic as much. Or the one problem I think is the biggest is that the leadership of Indymedia was overly technologically deterministic and utopian. They thought, and this is not everybody in the movement, and this is not every node. I would say this is a general tendency, right? So I want to be fair. There's many differences within Indymedia. But from what I saw as a general tendency, the leadership tended to think, or even if they didn't think it and they knew there was other ways, they tended to move towards a heavily technologically focused movement, right? So they, and I would argue this partly comes, and I'll mark this again, from the class position of many of the founders. Many of the founders weren't as much in struggle as working on struggle, and so they saw technology itself as the answer. Slick technological coding on the internet wasn't something that could empower communities who could then build power, but actually was the answer to building a movement. So one of the biggest problems, I would argue, is a technological utopianism, or even a determinism that kind of pervaded the movement. Along these lines, the organizers and activists prioritized building these fancy technological networks over organizing in the local communities they existed within. And I think this is sort of like the social technology that you were marking, saying they didn't prioritize social technology in the same way you marked it in the March on Blair. So many of the IMCs and the network had a really strong website and a strong local network, but they didn't have the grounded social relationships. And again, this isn't everywhere, but generally that they needed. And I know that Harvey talked to how important it is to be with the communities you work with, to know them, to build trust with them. That didn't happen. So that's a second associated problem. And connected to this, there was a prioritization of the global struggle over the local struggle, right? And so people didn't focus on the things happening in the same way in their backyard. So in Philly, there wouldn't be as much of a focus on the struggle over public education today, for instance. And the last, and I already marked it, was that there is a sort of technological determinism, but that I think comes from the class position of much of the leadership. And it led to a logic that didn't enable it to link to the massive social movements that were operating, and are still operating. So, and we could think of Occupy as a similar example, just one element of Occupy, that the General Assemblies, at least in Philly, demanded that if you were part of the General Assembly, you needed to be there at 5 p.m. to be part of a decision-making body. Now, a lot of working class families, they have kids to take care of. They have to be at work. They could not be there. And so there was a logic that came, it was a good, well-meaning logic, let's create an openness, but get people here, but it was a logic that led to barriers that didn't allow the massive social movement to join with the struggle in the way it needed to. I think that developed earlier within the Indymedia movement in some of their understanding of how to use technology. That said, we need to take advantage of the infrastructures, the independent media infrastructures that are built, both Philly IMC and MMP, but also Philly Cam in the city, Scribe, Prometheus, Harvey. There are real things we need to take advantage of, but when we do media activism and visual advocacy, all I'm trying to mark is we should be really cognizant of how we're doing it and what role we see media and technology playing in the work we do. That's it. Thank you.